So we're here to talk about the Apple Vision Pro. We're exactly a week on from WWDC. Not quite the announcement. We had to sit through an hour of autocorrect and emojis and stuff like that before we got to the one more thing. There was quite a lot of us watching the announcement through an investor lens, thinking about what this means for the overall ecosystem, for founders, for us as investors. And we thought it was great after a week of reflection to bring all of those amazing people together and give some of our thoughts. So myself, I'm Dave Haynes from FOV Ventures. Welcome to the panel. I'm going to ask you guys to go around anti-clockwise, just introducing yourselves. So Arian, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, so I'm Arian from Earthling.vc, a pre-seed fund focused on AR, VR, and AI primarily, which I call augmenting technologies. Came from a background of Meta Reality Labs as an engineer, was an AI engineer that works at spatial AI, and just recently decided to jump over to VC full-time, supporting founders really early.
Hey, my name is Andreas. I've been engineering manager and CTO in several startup companies, Product Hunt, and several others. I also run a small angel fund called RFC, doing very weird investments globally. So far, I have like 95 angel checks. Among other things, I'm very, very invested in 3D and VR.
Amal?
I'm Amal Doral from Anorak Ventures. Anorak is an emerging technology seed stage VC fund. Our managing partner, Greg, was a seed investor in Oculus. So we've been in AR and VR for 10 years now. We have a very active practice in AR, VR. We've invested in companies like Rec Room, Prisms, Oso VR. So really excited about the Apple Vision Pro and what it's going to do to the market.
Right, maybe we could just kick off very high level. We've had a week for the news to sink in. What do we all think actually about the headset? Amal, first impressions from you and Anorak.
Well, that very first impression where they did the camera panning around the headset, I was just thinking, no one knows how to instill just pure desire the way that Apple does. And that carried throughout the entire presentation. There was no fumbling, no awkwardness. Every room that they presented in was, beautiful with like beautiful furniture, beautiful people. They really set the standard for what it's going to take to make people want this. And then I think they follow that up with the best engineering in the world, right? So this is by far outclasses any VR headset you could get short of Vario and those super high-end enterprise headsets. So they pretty much dropped the best product in the history of this market in an astounding way. I was a little surprised at the moment by their approach to the software side of things. But now that I've had a week to think about it, I understand where they're coming from, and we can talk about that later. But overall, just completely blown away on the hardware side, from the materials to the design, everything.
Yeah, awesome. And Arian, I know you're coming at this from having been at Meta, so seeing the view from maybe the other side, and Apple is certainly now pretty much, Meta's closest rival. How did you see it go down? And I'd love to hear if any of your ex-colleagues were thinking about it in certain ways.
Well, I did message some of my ex-colleagues that I don't think really thought about it much, to be honest, which I think is a pretty good indicator of how things work there. But I think my concern before I saw the announcement was, is Apple going to bring out something that I think positions it as a bit of a zero-sum headset, right? Where, and this is going a little bit, I suppose, more to the ecosystem implications, but is this going to be something that actually makes like Quest obsolete for all intents and purposes? And so I think the result is actually pretty good for Meta, as much as I'm not necessarily their greatest fan with a lot of things. I think this actually bodes quite well with them, because I think Apple positioned this in a way that it's basically a prosumer device at this point. It's not really like a true consumer device at the price point. And I think what the use cases that they're presenting around it, versus the Quest, which is very clearly more geared at the kind of Roblox generation user. And I don't think those things are mutually exclusive at all. So I think if I'm actually Zuckerberg, I'm like, maybe I was holding my breath before the announcement, but after the announcement, I'm looking at this and thinking that with at least where Apple's trying to go initially, there is some opportunity for me here to carve out an important role in the ecosystem still. The only thing that Apple definitely does, and I think the main thing that Meta will away from is what Amal was kind of alluding to, about how Apple is just really good at making people want to put stuff on their bodies, right? And so more people are going to be normalized to it wearing a headset. More people, just sheerly because of the retail distribution that Apple has, are actually going to be able to try a headset, which wasn't really possible before. And I think everybody that's gotten to VR in some shape or form says that the aha moment they had with VR, where they really came around to when they actually tried it, right? And so just proliferating that experience now, I think is going to be a big thing even for someone like Meta, because I do see entirely possible that like, hey, this sense of presence I get in 3D is super cool. But let me go buy a headset for $300 to play games in it, right? Rather than spending $3,500. Like I could see a lot of that happening actually, even though some people might argue the contrary. And we can dive into that, how I see that playing out. But I think it's not a bad day for Meta, actually. I think it's a good day for the entire industry, which is, I think, rare with these kinds of things. But I think right now it looks like it's positioned for something where almost everybody wins. Maybe other than like the super small hardware providers, but I think overall everybody's winning.
Yeah, my sense is that if Michael Abrash over at Meta had carte blanche, he could probably match a lot of what Apple brought to the table from a hardware perspective. Maybe there's some stuff like the screens, which just requires force of weight in the supply chain. So there's probably maybe 10, 20% that Apple can do just because of their position. But it felt like the big pieces that Apple could bring to bear wasn't just the hardware, it's also the developer ecosystem. It's the people with phones that have their photo catalogs, that have all of the existing apps. Like that, to me, seems more of a long-term differentiator. I mean, to me, Meta have still certainly got time to catch up from a hardware point of view. And you can imagine now that some of these things, like with the latest screens, are probably things that only Apple could have brought to bear now, but there will be trickle down as those things now start to get manufactured, or as more kind of people in the supply chain gear up for that stuff. So yeah, I think Meta, I agree with what you said there, Arian. It feels like Meta will only kind of be encouraged by this because there's more interest, there's more developer interest, and they're never going to go to that high price bracket, so they can continue with the lower end, more social model, which fits their business model anyway. But Andreas, thoughts?
Quickly on the Meta versus Apple discussion. I think the question is not like, can Meta carve out the space next to Apple? The big question to me is Meta always tried to do gaming and enterprise and own both. And now it's like a really, really, really interesting question. I think they have to completely rethink how to do their whole enterprise strategy. And they can't not just like take the Quest and make it nicer. Like I don't think they can play this now anymore. But gaming is a different discussion. Gaming is like you have the Quest, you have like a ton of stuff coming from Asia, which all basically use the same hardware, and you have like PSVR and then a few other things. Regarding the Apple headset itself, I'm super hyped about it. I'm super hyped about it because, like, for two things. Number one, I'm a big believer in just like 2.5D VR with keyboard. Like just replacing monitors is like a very good starting point for like a lot of high quality interactions. And number two is it seems they really polish the UX, which so far nobody in VR XR has ever done. It's always like left to the developers of like individual apps to figure out the details, to make like stuff good, without actually having the unified hardware standards and like experience and all this kind of stuff. They just like really thought through the UX, and I think this will be one of the big changing points. And they also worked really smartly around like a lot of like inherent limitations, like the camera is like the obvious one, but also the fact that, for example, a lot of people get nauseous when they use a stick to walk in VR. So like, what if you just don't? And if you want to walk somewhere, you actually walk there. You know what I mean? And if you want to like have a stick, buy a stick extra. And that just like, it's just a different and fresh approach to the whole UX, which I just think is like the main contribution that I can do here.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about the 2.5D. So I guess you're essentially saying they really focused on viewing 2D screens in a 3D environment. And it's funny because watching the commentary as it played out on Twitter, I think a lot of people that have been in the VR ecosystem for a long time and just focused on that seems so, because people like were kind of doing that in 2016, 2017 and realized that people didn't want to stare at 2D screens if they had to buy a headset, buy PC VR, have all of these cables. Like it just wasn't right there. So it's almost like this idea. I think they're onto the right idea, and it's kind of the timing and the fact that they've now brought the screens to bear. Like it was only until they brought these new screens out that reading text made sense. So it's this kind of like perfect storm of different factors, which maybe just nobody else could compete with. But yeah, I'm also super excited about the 2.5D stuff and thinking about how existing 2D apps can maybe enhance what they do by adding that 0.5, or by adding stuff that flips from 2D into like, oh, I'm browsing this e-commerce store, but now I can actually pop out the full 3D object and then go into a sales room with an actual avatar and have a discussion about the object and things like that.
Also, like what David said on LinkedIn, David Jean is like completely correct. The eyes, as small as this appears, is a huge change because all of a sudden it's no longer an isolating experience. So like that, yeah, fully agree with David here.
Andreas said something really, I think, relevant there about the UX of Apple, right? And I think like I just want to call that out because I think it's a relevant point. I think that's the single thing that I was looking forward to the most is that when Apple brings out a device, it's well designed and the UX and the UI is pretty phenomenal. Which obviously everybody knows, like using a Quest is still a pretty clunky experience, right? From how the screens are set up, just the whole experience of getting kind of from putting the headset on to getting a tap is kind of not ideal. So I think that was the single point that I was really expecting Apple to take a step forward on the industry standard, which I think we definitely saw. So like my expectations were at the minimum fulfilled there. But I think it also speaks to, like, if you look at it from a little macro sense, like what the superpowers of like the big players in the space are, right? We all know that what Apple's extremely good at is exactly this kind of thing, like good design, good UX, making something people want, etc. Facebook, meantime, what they're very good at is scaling, right? They're not very good at creating things or innovating things necessarily, but they're extremely good at saying, like, we have something that we know works, or that has some like resemblance of product market fit, and now let's just like basically scale the shit out of it, right? Like if you look at all their successful products, it's basically what it is. So the fact that Apple now kind of can lead the way on some of these actual experiential fronts, and then for all intents and purposes, Meta can just copy that and scale it. I think that's actually pretty good storm for the industry.
Yeah. Amal, maybe if you could pick out some things that you thought maybe was either unexpected or things that you thought they could have done better, or just things you just outright didn't like.
So, as I said, I was very surprised by the software approach and this 2D approach. Andreas and I have had some debate about this, about whether this large monitor, world of monitors use case is an important one. As a technologist and as a VR and AR enthusiast, my belief has always been, well, you would just get that. That's not something that can't exist today. That's just a bunch of huge monitors. But I do see, an essential difference in what they're doing. What I think is, I have changed my position on that 2D experience. It kind of seemed unambitious to me in the beginning. Oh, why have these guys just tried to create a bunch of screens in 3D? But now I see it for what it is. Apple is selling this to essentially 7 billion people. The whole world is their market, and they need to get people to believe that there's something valuable for them there. And I think that people already have such close affinity with watching TV, looking at their photos, talking on FaceTime, that they can see the value in it and not like, oh, I'm going to be battling Darth Vader on Mars or something like that. So I think this is a really good way to get people to understand, hey, what's cool about this? Well, I have like a 100-inch TV and I can talk to people and I can have all my stuff in front of me. And the other thing I really like about their software approach is the fact that it's seated. You kind of saw that essentially the way they're expecting you to use this is sitting on a chair, by yourself in your place. And I think this is really good because of where Apple is. If you talk to people who try VR, 10, 15, 5, I don't know how many percent, but some percentage of them don't like it. They get motion sick. They feel disoriented. For whatever reason, they just don't like it. Okay for Meta. If Meta ships something and only 80% of the people like it, they're happy. But that's not good enough for Apple. Apple is trying to set a completely different bar, where if 3% of the people say this Apple product made me physically ill, that's an absolute no-go for them. And so they are giving an experience that's not going to do that to anyone. And I think that that's really important for consumer acceptance of VR, AR. That nobody's going to put on this headset and say, I got motion sick, because they're not going to be doing any motion. So those are two things which I felt negative about initially, but have come around on. The one thing that I haven't quite come around on is a lack of any controller, and the complete use of hand tracking. I do think if you see Steve Jobs talking about this many years ago, he says, the Mac will never have a touch screen because if you stick your hand out, um, your arm will get tired. And I think that a lot of the experiences that you could build with hand tracking, your arms will get tired if you try to use them in three-dimensional space. I know that they did support that Sony DualSense controller. I think there will be more support for additional controllers, or maybe some controllers will just emulate the DualSense. But I think that's something where they might, be a little looser over time and start allowing external hardware into the ecosystem.
Yeah, it feels like that's something where, I mean, we've seen with iPad, right? It's kind of, okay, you get an iPad Pro, but you may want a stylus, or like, so they position that as a kind of accessory. But I think what Apple does really well is just that kind of minimalism when it comes to the messaging. Like, they're announcing this for the first time, even if they know full well they're going to have like controllers at launch. It probably detracts from saying, like, imagine if they'd launched the iPhone and they said, oh, but a future iteration may have a stylus. It would just be a confusing message. I think one thing, and I hadn't really thought about this, but Theron actually just brought it up in the chat here, which is all of the stuff they showed, with the exception of FaceTime, which is, I guess, inherently social, even though it's more kind of one-on-one. Like, what I've seen through an investor lens is a lot of the really popular apps on Quest have been social. Now, obviously, that's because Meta is pushing social, but I think there's just something about co-presence in VR that you just can't do anywhere else. So what do we think about the fact that Apple wasn't really showing any kind of social experiences? Do we think that's just something that they didn't want to show in the keynote, or is it something they will be wary about because they're worried about moderation, or just how they'll kind of just operate multi-user? Arian, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, like, I had a lot of the same musings as Amal did, we just laid out, to be honest. I've sort of ended in the same place. I think a lot of obviously how Apple's positioning this thing is about approachability, right? And so, again, I think it's this distinction between like the normie that you're trying to basically do enterprise stuff in the headset, which is a lot of what they pitch, right? You watch TV, work, whatever, all great use cases, right? But if you're going that direction, you're pitching something different. I think that if you're pitching to like the Roblox generation, someone's like 12 years old. And I do think, like, if you're trying to sell to somebody that's like 40 years old, that like you should actually, let's say, use this as a monitor replacement, which is, I think, is a lot of how they actually pitch this and position this, is like, this is a replacement for your PC at the very least. You have to talk to them differently than you would, again, like a 12-year-old that they're social VR right now. And so I think, like, taking that step from I'm used to using my 2D computer and nothing else to like, we're going to do social VR, I think it's probably one step too far initially. And I think that's why they've kind of gotten this more, hey, we'll give you something that's still very relatable with 3D approach before maybe at some point down the line they start bleeding in a little bit more into the co-located 3D experience. That will be my guess, because I think one thing that was very conspicuous in the presentation is they didn't show anything ridiculously outlandish on the VR side in terms of like what you can really do in VR that you have absolutely no context in 3D, in 2D. And I think it's probably by design. So my guess is just, they're understanding their customer, probably understanding how to make this something that they feel like their customer can kind of relate to some extent. I think like showing, like, because I agree, right? Like, you look at retention curves and growth curves in VR apps, like a lot of these things are like gym class and some other apps that I've seen that play similar sort of game where it's, very kind of like, shoot the shit, social dynamic, social VR. I think it's a tough sell to like a normie 40-year-old professional, right? That you want to sell this thing as a monitor. So I think they kind of have to position it this way. Whether they go there or not long term, I don't know. But it makes sense that they don't really go that direction right now. The thing I'll say to that too is I think what I've been learning from talking to devs now over the last week and like comparing that to the presentation is, the presentation is very 2.5D, right? Like just doing a bunch of stuff within a spatial setting. The way that they're pitching this to a lot of developers, I think, has been, as at least from the feedback to me, has been there's a lot more like native support for these kind of like very, very 3D experiences and VR experiences, which to me says that they're really tailoring their messaging to both the customer, but then also the developers in terms of like, in a way that it's attractive to them to build / buy it. And, so again, that's just Apple. I think Apple just knows how to market, right?
Yeah, I think a couple of people have pointed out in the chat that they did show Rec Room, and even though they didn't show gameplay from Rec Room on the headset, they showed it in a kind of screen of the store. I think Rec Room's a really interesting case, right? Because they were built VR first, but they actually ported over to lots of 2D screens, including Xbox and PlayStation. So they know how to build VR. They have VR users, but they've also mapped all of their controls over to consoles. But Amal, I know you're an investor in Rec Room, or Anorak is an investor. Would love your thoughts on the Rec Room, how they're positioned, and will we see more things like that?
I mean, I think Rec Room is a great way for Apple to provide a better experience on Vision Pro than Meta has provided with Horizon Worlds on Meta Quest. It is an interesting example of how Apple's not completely shying away from VR. They're just not building into their first party applications. Similar to the iPhone, there are AAA games that you can play on the iPhone where, you have to tilt your phone to the side and, the status bar and the clock goes away, and you're fully in it. But Apple doesn't provide any of that stuff themselves. So I think the Apple environment will be very comfortable, very safe, very calm. And then there will be like cooler, more interesting stuff that you can go and do in Rec Room. But if it's not your thing, you can go back to your safe Apple environment. So I think it's good that they're leaving this to third parties. Of course, anytime you build as a third party on Apple, um, you're eventually potentially competing with Apple in the future. Um, but I think that many of these things exist outside of Apple's ecosystems. I don't think, any of the gaming ecosystems, for example, are really under direct threat from Apple. But when you are talking about social, I think Apple is a social company. They just are on a very tighter knit, smaller scale set of networks. I say the best social network is not Facebook or Instagram. The best social network is iMessage because everyone I actually care about is in iMessage. And there's like 300 people from high school who I'll never talk to again who are on Facebook. Um, and so I think a lot of the value of social VR is also that you want to be in social VR with people you want to be with in real life. You can put something out on Facebook and spam it out to like, the 1,000 people you have on your Facebook friends. But if you go to a bar, you want to be there with the people you actually care about. And I think that's the case for social VR as well. And so I think iMessage and the headset will be tightly integrated. Hey, we want to play mini golf. If I want to play VR mini golf, I guarantee you that anyone I want to play mini golf with is in the last 50 iMessages with me. So I can just pick them up, say, hey, you want to play mini golf? The headset starts ringing, saying, everyone's ready. We put on our headsets and we play. But I also think that Apple is rightfully going to delay how much they push these kinds of experiences because at $3,500, most people who have one are not going to know someone else who has one to start with. So I think it's something that'll come over time.
Well, that's for the reason I think the single-use stuff, right? I think that was something that was commented on that, like I've seen this a lot that people are saying, yeah, the display was very isolated experiences. And I think part of the reason for that is what Amal is saying, that like initially people that buy this will probably need to see the value of using it in your living room by yourself, right? Or rather than it being something that's completely dependent on, other users also doing it synchronously and doing stuff with them in 3D, right? So, that's also kind of a positioning thing that I think makes a lot of sense.
So Andreas, I want to come to you because obviously you're investing not just in this space, but across a number of different areas, and also thinking about future of work, working remotely, etc. So I'd love to, with your lens on it, like where do you think are the big opportunities? If we go outside of maybe gaming or entertainment, I want to kind of come back to those. Like where do you think are the opportunities, or what are the use cases you're excited to see that you don't think have maybe come to the VR market or XR market yet?
I have a direct answer and I have an indirect answer. I will first start with the indirect because that's how you know me. So we have a new platform launching, and we had this like multiple times before, like in the recent past, like Arian might remember like the Facebook platform launch. We all remember like mobile with like iOS launch and all this kind of stuff. Like this new platform launches, and whenever new platform launches, there is like low-hanging fruits that people can just grab and like make a ton of money with. By just being the first one who really gets it for that platform and do it right. There's also like a lot of like early distribution support and hacks that you frequently can do by just being like one of the first ones, being one of the ones that Apple really likes, being one of the ones that like the press really likes, and so on and so on, you know. And maybe like figuring out how to use iMessage correctly for distribution, you know, like there's a few things you can do early on in a platform really well and like make a lot of money with it. Not necessarily like VC cases, maybe, who knows, but it's good to start like companies here. The way I would think about this as a founder is just Apple just did like a developer conference where they showed what's possible, and they intentionally didn't overhype. They intentionally didn't sell you on the metaverse. They didn't sell you on like all the future possibilities. They just showed what's technically possible and basically told developers, you know, like these are the tools, here are the toys, figure out what you can do with it. You know what I mean? And I think the biggest opportunities for founders in this space is just to be on the edge of that. Like stress test what you can do with the SDK to the point that you feel you might break the things that Apple actually want you to do, like stress test as far as possible, stress test like how you get with the hardware, try what you can do if you combine phone and headset, watch and headset, multiple headsets in one thing, and so on and so on. Like what can you do if you like really stress test the edges of this thing, and just be an expert for that, and like really good opportunities will pop up by default. So the big question now is like, are there VC cases? I don't know. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like if I have a company that makes like double-digit millions, I don't care if it's a VC case or not. You know what I mean? Like, I'm happy. Yeah. When it comes to VC cases, I think the big opportunities are, at least for me, like we can talk about the obvious ones, which are like training, gaming, like all the classic VR cases. You know, we had them. But I think the biggest opportunity we have right now is we spent like multiple like let's say 1 or 2 generations where we took the whole office, like the whole creative space around you, and put it in a really small box. Like first, like in a desktop computer, then in a laptop, then in an iPad, like in a mobile. It's becoming smaller and smaller, and we're working in it, like with all our creative tools, everything in this small little box. And what's interesting to me is like, how does work change if you now like take this and like create a studio around you again? Like, how can you creatively work in all kinds of jobs, like from like actual creative jobs, like from starting from product design down to industrial design, like all this kind of stuff, but also even just like for collaboration. Like we talk and I go over to the wall and like move the post-its because the task is done. You know, like how can I rethink work if like the space around me becomes my studio again? You know, and I think there's like a lot of really interesting opportunities here. And the nice thing that Apple did is they, from the very first moment, they made apps next to each other. So you don't need to reinvent everything. You don't need to like hope that their Horizons play works out or whatever. You can just natively build apps. And if people like your app, they put it like in that corner and they use it on that wall, you know? And if they like your watch app, they throw it like on the wall behind you. If they like your Post-it thing, they put it over there, you know? And if you figure out like smart solutions to create a studio around, I think that could be one of the bigger opportunities. So like I would call like the augmented studio, basically. Like take the space around you and make it a studio, make it like interactable, and let other people also join in that space and change stuff, but it looks different for them, but they can come in and change stuff as well. There's also like a general opportunity around the idea that everything is becoming 3D. So we have now WebGPU, which is the successor of WebGL, which in fancy terms just means browsers are now capable of doing high performance 3D without any performance hit. And that means you can play Fortnite in a browser, for example. That also means you can do it like pretty soon, like on a mobile. And that also means that there's a high chance that the future of mobile is that when you like tilt your phone, that everything is 3D and augmented. So like you're on a shopping site, like IKEA, you look at it, you like it, you tilt your phone, and now you see it in your room. And it doesn't matter if it's a headset or not, but like if you have the headset, it's even better, you know? It's like there's just a general move towards 3D and 3D becoming a default interaction. And it's not like specific VR, like VC cases. Like if I would know them, I wouldn't be an investor, you know? But I think this is like the space I would explore personally. I can talk like 5 hours more like this, but I want to like stop intentionally.
Amal?
Oh, I was just saying, I think shopping and e-commerce is going to be huge in 3D. I think if you look at like everything you look at on Amazon, it's just like you get a 2D picture of it. I think that's essentially already obsolete. Like a lot of stuff you need to understand, like how big is it? What material is it made of? How would it look over here? So I think these are going to be big use cases, and we do have a investment in this space in terms of delivering 3D experiences for e-commerce.
One quick note here is also like if everybody comes up with the obvious cases, like if everybody comes up with e-commerce and like all the obvious cases, can you do a meta level play where you just enable all of them to do it? And you do not like try to be the one e-commerce solution, but you're trying to support all of them. And this is also like a good strategy in this kind of market right now.
I think that gets made possible now what Andreas is saying, because I think like one of the things as an investor I was always looking at is I think like kind of platform infrastructure plays have been very difficult in VR because there's just not enough content and not enough users, right? I think there are very few. I mean, like someone I think beamed up like spatial first design in 3D, like, you know, Andreas have made an investment in that space. I think that works. But I think the main thing that's happening from my perspective here is that, again, Andreas also alluded to that. There are like basically 3 use cases of VR right now that work, which is gaming, training, wellness, fitness, and then enterprise. And so what you're getting now with Apple is all of a sudden you're getting in VR all the competencies your phone can do. And that definitely opens up the canvas in terms of the creativity that you can have, because all of a sudden you're not in the Quest paradigm anymore, where effectively your VR headset is completely an isolated computing experience from the rest of your stack, right? That goes away now. They're completely vertically integrated now. And so I think even in those existing use cases, you can just do things that start to get more interesting. Like, for example, gamified fitness is something that works really well in VR right now, right? Like, Beat Saber, Fit XR, these sorts of things do quite well. But the problem is still that like whatever you're doing there in terms of fitness, right, kind of stays in the headset. Now in Apple, what you can do is you can actually start like building a gamified experience all the way through the stack, right? So maybe one day you get your points or whatever you want to call it in the headset. The next day you can get it on your phone because you actually go for a run, right? And all this stuff is like completely vertically integrated to the extent that I think it's just much easier to start driving more value across multiple ecosystems, where one component happens to be the 3D side of it, right? Which also I think will probably help the adoption if people start doing that. So those are the sorts of applications also I'm looking at, was like within the conventional realm of applications that we know to work in VR. Like I think you put it on steroids effectively. Subsequently, from the investor side, I think make some of these plays more valuable.
Yes. To quickly add to this, like another matter to think about this, a level to think about this would be, what if like only one person in the team has the headset, but other people have like their MacBook or their phone? And like in gaming, that's obvious, but like how would this look like for other industries and other jobs? And I think in design, it like kind of makes sense, but maybe that's also like super interesting in other areas.
Yeah. One thing you said in the last answer, Andreas, was just mentioning about WebXR and the web itself becoming more 3D. It was very interesting to see Apple making a few senior hires that come from that world and then openly out the gates supporting WebXR. So I guess that leads me to my next question. And I'm really trying to think about this. I don't know what the answer is yet, but kind of in terms of developers, like who is set up well to win this? Is it people developing for the open web, leveraging WebXR? Is it people who are coming to this from Unity? I mean, Apple were very vocal about, yes, we support Unity. And I think Unity stock actually shot up on that news. But is it like people who already know how to do great, fully immersive VR? Or is it people just focused fully on, no, actually, we're going to come with the tools that Apple have provided us and build kind of natively within the Vision OS ecosystem?
I have like the maker mindset here. The people who will be very successful are the people who have an idea and very quickly build with whatever is like needed. Like it doesn't matter if it's Unity, Web, or Swift or whatever. It doesn't matter if you're like the top expert in this, but like if you get to the point that the prototype is actually working, you can convince very good people to join you. You know what I mean? And I think those people will win. So like the flexibility and so on and so on. And like obviously like with AI tools, this becomes easier, but like I think these kind of people will succeed.
Yeah. One really exciting thing for me, which is less obvious, is that if you think about the mobile, it was great because people could get their apps running very quickly. You build an app, very lightweight team, very low cost. You get it onto the App Store. I mean, Apple has a review process, but from idea to testing and iteration and then publishing, it was quite a short time span. I feel like we lost that in VR because actually finding the right talent, developing a project in Unity or Unreal, like making sure that it was VR ready, all these different things. There weren't many startups that were doing really quick iterations. They had to kind of work for 12 months and then they needed to get through Meta's process and hope that people would. Whereas now I'm hoping that this really shortens those development cycles and we can really go back to kind of startup lean methodology of like, right, we've got an idea for an app, ship it, test it, and then move on.
Plus, they don't need to build everything. They're not expected to manage your whole experience. They're just expected to do like a little clock for the wall. You know what I mean? And that's like a completely different challenge.
Yeah. One question would be, what are some areas for investors or startups to avoid? It feels like, again, thinking back to the early iPhone days, Apple would announce something at the next WWDC and it would automatically kill 3 startups. You're like, there goes this app or that app. Are there any things that you would say to entrepreneurs, maybe just avoid this, either because it's not going to work or because Apple will do it themselves?
Who wants to be recorded and then proven wrong?
That's what I'm thinking about. Like, I'm going to say something and then, be a meme on Twitter at some point about, how wrong you got it.
Flashlight apps, right? Where, okay, they made a few $1 million selling 99-cent flashlight apps and then they got put out of business. So those are just trivial apps. Then there's apps that perform some kind of like key infrastructure role for the ecosystem. Like, let's say the thing comes out and you can't cast from a Mac to a Vision Pro very easily, and someone goes and builds something that does that. That's a pretty vulnerable spot to be.
Yeah.
But I think that when you look at the companies that have built, big businesses on the iOS App Store, if you look at any app that's ever been, top 10 grossing, I don't know that any of them have been put out of business by Apple, right? So the one big question mark there is around what Apple is doing with advertising and essentially making a hard play for all that advertising revenue. But other than that, I don't see that as being a big risk. So there are certain areas, obviously, that are pretty vulnerable. But if you're building your own thing, I think you're in a pretty good shape. And yes, may 5-6 years from now, Apple do something, but hopefully you have the strength to stand on your own. One of our companies called Arthur has built the best remote work tool in VR. And they're used in the Fortune 500 now. And someone asked me on Twitter, could Apple come and do this? I think, yes, they could come and do this. And also they are coming and doing this. Like, they're showing you with their FaceTime and, that they have a vision for what remote work could look like in Vision Pro and will look like. I don't think that means that Arthur is, dead in the water. Will Apple take some market share here? Yes. But also Arthur is willing to do the one-on-one work with a lot of enterprise customers that Apple just traditionally hasn't done. They don't go and do deep enterprise interactions with ERP systems and things like that. So people who are scared of Apple competing with them, I think, are probably better off just starting to build and let the investors worry about whether this can be a $10 billion or a $1 billion outcome. Either way, it's a good outcome for you. Yeah, I would say that there are a lot of people right now who are already doing that. I would say 5+ years ago, it was definitely the case that you had to have some 3D or game dev or some kind of background to build anything in VR. I don't think that's true anymore. So when you look at some of our earlier companies like Ozo VR, which does surgical training in VR, the guy who built that, Justin Barad, he was a game dev before he was a surgeon. And that's what it took. But now, like, if you look at a company like Prism that's doing math education in VR, the founder, Anorak, had no VR experience, no game dev, no software, no anything background in VR. All of her background was in her domain. She was a math education administrator and a curriculum leader in New York City public schools for math. And so you see someone with incredible domain experience now able to come in and build a great XR company. I think there'll be more of those. I think the talent is now out there that can be hired. And I think if you just kind of sit around waiting to see whether Apple is going to be a threat to your market, I think the market's going to pass you by.
Yeah, so I guess that brings me to what I'll make the last question before we open it up to the LinkedIn comments. it's the question about timing. And this is a thing, as an investor, but, also more critically as a founder, timing is everything. You can have the right idea at the wrong time and vice versa. So what do we think? I mean, they've announced stuff now. There's testing centers being set up, but nobody actually has any dev kits, and we don't quite know how they'll be distributed. Then there's probably going to be a first run of the first device, which is maybe sits around kind of 1 million units, or again, maybe those numbers change. So it could well be another 2 years before we really see this reaching numbers. And, a device like Meta already has, 10 million plus headsets. So what's your advice for founders who are watching this now, thinking, right, should I start a business, or should I really start focusing on the Apple ecosystem? How are you guys thinking about timing for this?
I have thoughts on this. I can go on other side. Anyway, like for me, I think the reality is like, if you're going to start a company today or build something today, like if let's say you're pre-seed and you want to get to seed, right? You have to kind of figure out how to generate value in the meantime, right? Like you can't just kind of chug along as you're building it out. And particularly the market I think we've been in. And so I think first and foremost, anytime you're starting a company, you have to be like, why am I using this medium to generate value for a customer, a specific customer? And so that principle, I don't think just goes away because Apple exists all of a sudden, right? And so I think a lot of that can still be proven out on request, right? And I would look at kind of Apple at this stage more of as a growth strategy. You probably have to plan for, but realistically, you're not going to bring anything meaningful to market there, like Dave, like you said, probably for at least a year, if not longer, right? So I think you got to kind of build for Quest now for later. I think if you're building today, that's really the only way to do it. Because I think I think a lot of the topic of the last few points that we've had is like, basically optimize for building quicker. If you're going to sit around for a year to Apple to come around, somebody might already be working on your idea, just port the Quest, right? They might be ahead of you. Granted, there are certain things you can't replicate, but I still think you replicate value on a Quest as proof of concept. And so that's what I would do if I was building right now. It's built for Quest.
Yeah. And Andreas, how does that sit? Because you were saying there was, obviously there are some first mover advantages, like being that category leader on the App Store, like having the kind of the positive effects of distribution when Apple features you on its first store. So how do you juggle those two things? Because build for Meta, you can't be building for Meta with the same infrastructure that you might be building for Vision OS. So yeah, there's a difficult kind of balancing act there, right?
So I always think that panels need to be like Fox News. So we just like fundamentally agree with everything Arian just said. Like my personal POV is build as build. Like there's no point in like looking at timing and everything. Like in so many cases, the idea you start with isn't the idea you end up with. And if you wait for the right time, you will wait until you die. And like I can like do like a lot of other smart things like that, but like basically the idea is like build. I also think it might be better to build for the iPhone with like AR than to build for the Quest right now. If you want to like learn the ecosystem, as long as you don't have a device. Yeah. It also depends what kind of founder or what kind of product you want to build or be. If you want to be like if you want to do like the maker approach, which I would highly recommend, it's just like build 100 things. And if Apple replaces some of them, who cares? Like right now, if the people build AI apps, they have like 4 or 5 good months. They make a lot of money with it, and then whatever, it's done, And I think that's completely okay. That's a problem if you take VC, and that's a problem mainly for the investor, not for you, But that's completely okay. And I also think it's completely okay to go in and say very boldly, if you're the kind of founder we're going to do something that most likely Google and Apple also wants to do. So for example, we're building the Office for VR, and obviously Google will do that, and obviously Microsoft will do that, and obviously Apple will do that, But why the fuck not? Like, why not? Because if you even manage to be somehow good at it, there's a high likelihood that some of them, or like a Chinese competitor or somebody else, will just like buy you. So, yeah. And then even you also have to remember that like a lot of the Microsoft Office suite was actually acquisition. A lot of the biggest Google apps are acquisitions, and so on and so on. You know what I mean? So it's not like if it's just in their playing field, that's actually a good thing potentially. If you want to build like proper big and like take big money and everything, you have to have the network for that, you have to have the experience for that, and so on and so on. A lot of disclaimers, but if yes, then do,
Cool. So I'm going to move it over to questions. So if you guys can start putting your questions for the panel in the chat. While you do that, and if you've done one previously, just re-put it into the chat because we can't see the ones that came before. But while we're waiting for people to post their questions, I just have one maybe last final question, and Amal, maybe you want to take this. Just in terms of what you're seeing, we're only a week on, but my sense is, we've had a lot of extra interest in the fund. I'm speaking to other VCs who haven't focused on this space, who are all of a sudden calling me up and saying, "Oh, Dave, that VR thing you were talking about, like, tell me more about that." About, like, what are you seeing? Do you think we're going to benefit from a renewed interest for other investors, or am I just living in a bubble where I'm only seeing that stuff? Like, what's your view on overall investor appetite for this segment?
I don't think it's been night and day. I mean, people woke up to this space on Monday. I think for sure we have a lot of interest coming into us as well to talk about this space. But I don't think investors and LPs and so I don't think these are going to be the guys leading the charge here. I think it's the builders who are moving much, much faster. And if you look at the history of this stuff, like Uber was launched within 1 year of the first iPhone with GPS being released. And Instagram was released within that same year that the first iPhone with a front-facing camera was released. You have to be quick on this stuff. There are generational companies built at the beginning of these platform shifts. And if you want to build one, you have to be ready. And you can't be sitting around saying, "Oh, I'll wait for the device to come out, and then I'll see whether it gets any mass market adoption, and I'll see whether people accept the $3,500 price point." You can't do all that. You have to you have to be ready. And so whether that's building on iOS and using the Reality Pro SDK and or whether that's prototyping some experiences on Quest Pro because it has eye tracking, although I don't know how much of that eye tracking is available to the developer in Vision Pro. But if you have a belief that this device opens some important new use case, build it. And the VCs will be slower than you to catch up, and the LPs will be even slower than the VCs. So I think it's the founders who are going to be the fastest and the boldest and the most impactful here. So I wouldn't worry about what's happening in our ecosystem, in investor land.
One quick side note here is also already had one deal of ex-Apple people who building for the Vision where I wanted to get in, and I was too late, and it was taken by a top tier firm.
Wow.
So.
Oh, I missed that one, Andreas. You should have sent it over.
What I'm saying is the market is adapting really quickly, it seems.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
I think it will, and it has to, right? I mean, it's I think also naturally because what people are seeing, and I'm seeing people use more about, because I've been saying this for a while, but I think now it's more visual for a lot of folks, is that given that we've been in an AI hype level, XR is almost like a window to AI, right? And I think there's kind of a very natural progression there from these technologies, right? It's very immersive computing paradigm. And so I think that because of that, I've already seen a lot of people news about this off the back of the AI hype bubble, where I actually think there might even be some tailwind just from that, right? That it's you put Apple together with what's going on with AI, and they're like, "Oh crap, this is actually an interesting playground for a lot of these things that we're working on." So I think that'll probably happen as well.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks for that. So I'm going to come to the first question. So Nina says, I guess maybe in reference to one of the comments earlier, would us as VCs consider success startups that would be bought by companies like Apple from an XR perspective? Andreas, maybe you can comment on that because you were talking about.
Comment number one, Oculus, several billion, I remember. YouTube to Google was also 1 or 2 billion or something like that. Companies get acquired for serious amounts, like WhatsApp and whatever, you name it. So it's definitely acquisition by a big company itself isn't a bad thing, obviously. The problem you have here is the big acquisitions aren't sold, they're bought. So it's almost impossible to try to sell it, to build it and sell it. You have to build something that's so much of a threat that they want to buy it. And that's just really hard to do. And it's really hard to plan for. So I wouldn't worry about this. And if you are in a lucky position that some of the big dogs buy you, great. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay, next question. We can't see the user, but the user asks, what verticals generate lasting usage in mobile AR today? I guess for me, that's an interesting question as well, because as an investor, am I looking for net new companies, or am I looking maybe for apps that are already a breakout success in the mobile AR category that then work even better when you're on Vision OS? But yeah, when you take a look at mobile AR today, do any of you see any kind of apps that you think have generated lasting usage?
I don't invest in mobile AR. I say that pretty upfront. I don't believe in it. So I've tried it actually. I've done that because I've invested in some things I thought very interesting, and I think will eventually succeed in a more true AR paradigm. But to me, don't stick in mobile. And so I've kind of I'm very, very bearish on mobile AR entirely.
Interesting. Amal, maybe you have a view on that, mobile AR?
Again, it's not something we do a ton of in terms of end user experience. In terms of technology providers like Ventana, who's doing you know, 3D models for e-commerce, I believe that, you know, IKEA or Nike will include mobile AR features into their applications, and then there can be vendors, enterprise vendors targeting that. Um, but in terms of standalone mobile AR, probably not. So it's mainly in kind of the back end and the enterprise applications of mobile AR.
Got it. Next question from Dilara. For VCs, are XR startups more interesting for you guys now after Vision Pro? Are you really looking closer to the space?
I was planning to invest half of the fund into VR anyway. So for me, it doesn't necessarily change. Does it get more interesting? This is the thing that I'm worried about. As the investor, I'm thinking about, you know, power laws and all of that. That I'm obviously a little bit fearful, as Andreas was saying, that a lot of these kind of more interesting companies now are just going to be circled in by larger investors earlier, which makes it more competitive for us, slash more expensive, right? Which is from that point of view, I can't get excited, right? Get excited about there being cooler companies, just more use cases, and really this kind of industry pushing forward. What I'd be lying if I was saying I'm thinking a lot about the actual financial implications that kind of has for our fund economics and all of that. So it's like bittersweet, I would say, is the short answer.
Yeah. It's funny because we actually called the FOB Ventures, our first ever pitch to our investors was like, hey, we're the fund that's going to invest in spatial computing. And then we went out to raise some money and everyone was like, what the hell is spatial computing? Or maybe they'd heard it from Magic Leap or like, oh, that's never going to take off. And then the last few years, we've been leaning more into kind of metaverse, which I think encompasses a much larger set of technologies. And it's more like this kind of, you know, just more 3D immersive compute and the internet. So whether you call it XR or metaverse, like for us, it's just this, you know, this is now just the next thing along the line of compute and the internet becoming more 3D. Whether you're looking at the internet or you're doing your work through a Vision Pro or a Meta Quest or a mobile or a console, like, you know, that's for us, it's irrelevant what the actual kind of hardware is. It's just the evolution of what software will become now that we have all these different ways to kind of create content, view it more immersively, etc. So yeah, for us, I would imagine over the next 6 months, we will add more companies that look like more XR startups. Like we just did something in VR gaming. We just did something in VR wellness and meditation. You know, that was a specific like, well, we have the headset coming out. What are some things that we think will work on it? But yeah, we were going to do that anyway. I think this has just maybe accelerated and validated the market a little bit more.
Definitely validated the market, yeah.
Yeah. Amal, what about you guys? You were pretty OG. I mean, you've been investing in this for a long time, and you know, Greg has obviously been in Oculus since day one. So this is nothing new for you. But how do you see this tipping the scales of more or less investments into XR?
Yeah, of course, the big investors are going to come in, and it's gonna harm the economics to us, but that's okay. I mean, I think a greater impact will be on the actual market, and this is going to make spatial computing acceptable to an end user. You know, you will have like a Fortune 500 CEO willing to put on an Apple Vision Pro when there's no reason that he would ever put on a Meta Quest 2. And then you know, when these executives put these headsets on, they will start to recognize that there are all these interesting enterprise and productivity use cases. Then they might see some of the other use cases, like, okay, I just did my business meeting in Arthur, but now I can golf and, you know, golf plus VR. Or I think it's going to be great to have a Halo brand here in XR, where people are going to see this as something desirable which the Quest 2 really never has been. It's been always seen as like a kid's toy.
One quick thing to add here is we keep thinking of the Vision Pro as like a piece of hardware. And I think that's like super important. They basically just like kill the base expectation, that's amazing. But the really interesting thing for me is how they really thought through how everything should go together. Like you build with Swift, you use this and this SDKs, you're doing, it's not hand tracking, it's eye tracking, and you use your hands to click, and like you can use your keyboard, and you have like all the apps. They don't need to build like the whole environment. They have like the little apps, you can just like build them really quickly. You have like very clear developer pipelines, you have very clear testing pipelines, all this kind of stuff. They just like thought it through. And that just like, to me, this changes a lot, like how people can approach everything. And therefore it also like changes like what kind of companies are actually feasible for all of a sudden. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that's a really good comment to end on. So I'm going to be respectful of people's time. We're at the top of the hour. So how do people approach you or get in contact with you if they are building in this space and want to pitch you? Amal?
You can email me, at amal@anorak.vc, or you can come to our website, anorak.vc, and submit your company to our portal, or also connect with me on Twitter. So anyone who's building in this space, please reach out, because I'm happy to talk to anyone, regardless of whether you're raising capital right now or not.
Yeah, awesome. Andreas?
Twitter, like the handle is in the thingy. Just DM me.
Nice. And Arian, you've also had some big announcements this week.
Yeah, I mean, so just like Andreas' Twitter handle, you can find my email there, like DM or email is good. And I mean, yeah, Dave, to what you're saying, it's like we kind of officially announced the fund earlier today. So tried to keep it quiet for a while, but realized that wasn't feasible anymore. So we kind of came out with it officially. But yeah, you can find me on Twitter, and you'll also find my email and everything.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I'm Dave from FOB. So it's just Dave at FOB.ventures. LinkedIn is a really great place to just message me. I do look at inbound LinkedIn. You can also go to the website FOB.ventures, or go to my Twitter handle, which is at Haynes_Dave. But yeah, we'll wrap up now. Thanks to everyone who joined us for the panel. Thanks for Amal, Andreas, and Arian, the AAA. That's officially the AAA VR investors. Thanks for your input. And yeah, let's see. We should probably reconvene in 6 months' time, see how it's gone, just as we're on the verge of launch.
Absolutely. And thanks for hosting, Dave. This is great.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
You, Dave.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.